Well, hello. Hey, everyone. We're live. So, this morning we had not one, but two technical problems when we tried to stream church live from St. Mike's. So it didn't happen. So big apologies to everyone who couldn't join us online. It wasn't something we could fix in the moment. We're going to try and work on that this week, and hopefully we will one day have a Sunday where all our streaming stuff works and it's not full of technical problems, hopefully starting next week. But in the meantime, for those of you who did miss out, I just wanted to share again our message from this morning. For the last few weeks, we've been looking at a book called Be Still, which is basically a guide on how to spend a little bit of time every day with God in a way that suits your personality and your time of life. You know, whether you're hectic, busy, or whether you've got the space and whatever your personality is, and trying to do it in a way that matches you. And then this week, we are looking specifically at the place of wonder and awe and imagination in that. So I'm going to do this live because it's more interesting that way. So if you do want to comment while I'm on, that would be great. Have a little banter, a bit of back and forth. I've got my cup of tea. I've got my Bible here, and I'm ready to roll. We are going to be in Psalm 8 as we look at this whole thing of wonder, awe, and imagination in our prayer life. So I have a sip of tea. I'm going to bash on with Psalm 8, which is entitled in the Bible, according to Gittith, a Psalm of David. No idea what a Gittith is. There you go. But it's written by David, King David, famous King David, who was also a bit of a prolific songwriter, and he wrote this one. So this is Psalm 8, and it goes like this. Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Through the praise of children and infants, you have established a stronghold against your enemies, to silence the foe and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the works of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what are mere mortals that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? You have made them a little lower than the heavenly beings, and crowned them with glory and honor. You made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet, all the flocks and herds, all the animals of the wild, the birds of the sky, the fish of the sea, all that swim the paths of the seas. Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. So this psalm is very much a psalm of wonder, of awe, of amazement, of looking at the things that God has made and been drawn up into worship of him. Now, as we look at this whole topic, I've got to admit, I'm not coming from a place of awe, and wonder and amazement and praise and all of those kind of things, but where I think a lot of people are coming from, certainly who I chat to, of a bit overwhelmed, a bit stressed, a bit too much on their plate. But actually, as I thought about this whole thing of wonder and awe and all that kind of stuff, and the people who it was who were most in awe of God and most encountering God, it wasn't people who had everything together. So I think back to people like Job and Jeremiah and Stephen, for example. So Job was this guy who got absolutely everything taken away from him. He's absolutely ruined, his health, his family, his well-being, his money, everything absolutely destroyed. And it's actually at his lowest point, questioning God and whether God was good and all of that kind of thing, that he actually got this glimpse of the bigness and the amazingness of God. Too big for him to be able to put in words, to really be able to conceive of it. Then Jeremiah, this prophet, who thinks his whole nation, who is supposed to follow God, have turned their back on God. He's got an arrest warrant out on his life. He's in the middle of the wilderness. He wants to die. He's depressed beyond depressed. He's really low. And it's in that moment that God meets with him and he has this revelation of God. And then Stephen, he is literally facing a death squad. Not long after Jesus has died and come back from the dead, returned to heaven, he's telling people about Jesus. He's got in so much trouble for doing that. He's facing this death squad, and it is as he does so that just for him, God opens up a glimpse of heaven and Stephen gets to see Jesus up there in heaven ruling and reigning. And so it's actually the people who are under the cosh who get to see the amazing awe and wonder of God revealed to them. It's not for the people who have lots of time and an easy life and are wandering around just like appreciating everything, but really those of us who need it. There was a really popular book in the 80s and the 90s in Christian circles called Too Busy Not to Pray, with the simple idea behind it that nearly all of us say, well, I don't have time for prayer in my life. But actually, it's because we don't have time for prayer in our lives that we need to make time for prayer. And certainly when you go back and look at the heroes of the Christian faith throughout history, the ones who did incredible things, always sacrificed, always got up early, which makes me sad, especially to spend time in prayer. It was indispensable to them. But I think we could maybe update that advice for our own era. That is to say that we are too stressed and overwhelmed not to pray. That actually the stress and the overwhelm that seems to push out that intimacy and that time with God is the very indication that we need to make time to be with God. And just like all those people throughout history who under the most intense pressure got to see a revelation of God, that is something that perhaps we need to do too. Encounters with God throughout history come with the emotional reaction of awe and wonder. If we go right back to a guy called Moses, we read about in Genesis, the first book of the Bible. He is going about his business, his work as a shepherd, and he sees a bush on fire, and that's unusual because bushes on fire normally burn up, and this one didn't. And what he thought was fire was actually the presence of God. And so he makes his way up to this bush, and realizing it is God and hearing God's voice, he removes his sandals, a sign of awe and reverence and respect. After that, he gets greater and greater revelations of God in pillars of cloud and fire on the mountain, and so much so that he has to start wearing a veil over his face like a bride would, because he is reflecting the glory of God, and it's so powerful, so bright, he has to shield other people from it. And then we go through to the time of Jesus, and we know the ending, but at the time they didn't know who he was. He was another teacher, another prophet, another person sent from God, certainly not God himself. And so, but every now and then there is a breakthrough where someone realizes the divine nature of Jesus, that this is actually God incarnate, and it's far too much for their minds to take in, far too big news. And so in those moments they are overwhelmed with awe and wonder. One of those moments happened in a boat where there was a great big storm happening, and Jesus spoke to the storm and it stopped. And they knew, his followers knew who were in the boat with him, only God gets to speak to the weather and control it. And so Peter, one of his followers, falls down at his feet, recognizing who he is. Revelations of God in everyday life inspire awe and wonder. And this is the stance of Psalm 8. The song, the prayer that we're looking at today, which starts, Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory in the heavens. But what I found really intriguing and interesting as I was preparing this talk, as wandering around the park and thinking about it and praying about it, was actually what we've got here are two sets of emotions that have to do with things being too much, but one's really positive and the other is really negative. So on the one hand, we've got stress and overwhelm because it's just too much for us to handle. But on the other hand, we've got the sense of awe and wonder that comes when something's just so big, so incredible. But that's a really positive emotion. So these two things that look like opposites are actually dealing with this sense of overwhelm, but one really negative and one really positive. So what is happening here? Well, Lizzie, my wife, is going through Brené Brown's new book, Atlas of the Heart, which basically is it's kind of like a reference book for all the different emotions that human beings experience. And it references all kinds of psychological journals and sociology journals and all that kind of stuff. So it's really well researched. And really interestingly, I opened it up yesterday, and two of the categories are particularly these things that I was thinking about. One where we feel overwhelmed in a negative sense, and another where we feel overwhelmed in a positive sense. And so, overwhelm and stress and panic and fear belong to that first category. But awe and wonder belong to this second category. And when you look into the research around what's happening emotionally in us around awe and wonder, it's essentially when something is so big, we can't accommodate it into our normal mental structures, our normal ways of thinking. It's much bigger than anything that we have a label for or even a way of understanding. And what they found was that people who have these experiences of awe and wonder tend to grow in humility, tend to be more likely to share their resources, cooperate with other people. And one of the journals goes as far as to say that an awe-inspiring experience might be the fastest and most effective method of personal change that we know about. In other words, when people encounter something wonderful, awe-inspiring, they change. They become more generous, more cooperative, kinder, in a way that would normally take a long time to happen. And of course, not to brag, but the Christian faith has known about this for a long time. There's a book in the New Testament called Philippians, which was written to a bunch of people in Philippi. That's where they lived. And the author of it, Paul, is really keen that these people should get along better than they are and should be sharing their stuff and looking after one another better than they are. And so rather than just berate them for what they're not doing, what he regularly does in this letter to them is encourages them to be thankful, to remember how great God is, to look particularly to the example of Jesus, and to think about good things, noble things, worthy things, trustworthy things. Knowing instinctively what these psychologists and sociologists are discovering now afresh. That actually, when we look to things much bigger than ourselves, better than ourselves, more beautiful than ourselves, it actually draws us out of ourselves and helps us to live better. It transforms us. Wonder leads to worship, which leads to personal change. As we leave our small world and enter into a bigger world. This is the power and the strength of being small, which we have a hard time understanding. In fact, people have always had a hard time understanding, but this is how it works in God's economy. Is that when we realize we're small, we are stronger. It's the sanity of realizing your correct size, how big you actually are than how big you think you are. And this feeling of wonder, as we said, doesn't belong just to Christians. It's a human experience. Anyone who's been in the presence of something incredibly beautiful or large or very old or an incredible accomplishment experiences the feeling of wonder and awe. So, for example, glimpsing a mountain that goes back an unbelievably unthinkable amount of time, and that is so much bigger than you that you could only ever be a visitor on it. It dwarfs us. My dad was lucky enough to visit Everest, trek to Everest Base Camp, and he told me that he's climbed a lot of mountains in the UK, but when the walking group first glimpsed Everest, their necks just kind of craned back and they all went silent as their heads just went up and up and up, as they saw this enormous thing that they didn't have a reference for. It's so much bigger than they could have imagined. And in those moments, everyone goes silent. Or perhaps it's an incredible piece of artwork that just grips you, that seems to transcend time and space. I remember my first experience of that on a holiday in Spain. I saw this old tapestry that kind of depicted all the different worlds that a human being could live in, from like a kind of tormenty hell place through to earth and then up to heaven. And for some reason, this just absolutely captured my little imagination. For whatever reason, I just stared and stared at it. I was just gripped by it. Or perhaps something as simple as passing an oak tree and realizing that that tree has stood for dozens of generations It has stood silently as empires have come and gone and just done its oak thing quietly, strongly. That's not a word. But it's been there that whole time. And as you ponder that, it brings about a sense of awe and wonder. And it's in those moments we are drawn out of ourselves and realize we're just a speck of dust in the span of history in an enormous universe, but not in a bad way, in a way that is somehow transcendent, beautiful, liberating even. And that's really important for us as human beings because, and this is my free bit of advice for all of us to take away today, we are not God. And we often live like we do. That's where the sense of stress and overwhelm comes from. We get to believing that if I don't do this, everything's going to fall apart. If I can't get everything done, if I can't do it all well, everything's doomed, everyone's in trouble. And of course, it's not even remotely true. We are not God. And when we are put in our place by this sense of wonder and awe and transcendence, we realize we're just passing through this speck of dust in the universe and in history that God has placed there. I love the refrain in Charles Wesley's hymn, Love Divine, comes at the end of every verse, lost in wonder, love and praise. It's this sense of being so drawn out of ourselves that we forget ourselves. We're lost, but lost in a good way. We've forgotten all about those problems and the weight and that over sense of responsibility that we carry and realize that God has got this. Recognizing our smallness is a strength. It's what it says in Psalm 8, in the Psalm, the prayer that we're looking at today. In verse 2, it says, through the praise of children and infants, you have established a stronghold against your enemies. Through the praise of children and infants, you have established a stronghold against your enemies. When we praise, we acknowledge that we are connected to and dependent on God. And who knows our need of others better than a child, better than an infant, as the psalm says. You know, there's no toddler going around a house going, so I'm very busy today. I've got a lot of things on my schedule. I might be able to make room for you after my 3:30, but if I don't get these things done, we're in trouble. No, a child knows that there's no breakfast, lunch and dinner and snacks without mum and dad. They are totally aware of their dependence and they're totally okay with that. In fact, children in every sense get this way better than we do. They are naturally full of wonder and awe. Mud is amazing. Insects are amazing. Exploring around the house is amazing. The world is amazing and full of wonder. And it's only as we get older and we get an overinflated sense of our importance that we forget to live with wonder and with awe. Jesus quotes this very verse about through the praise of children and infants you've established a stronghold. But this time he uses it in reference to the poor, both the literally poor and the spiritually poor, all of those around him at the time who knew that they needed Jesus. Those who felt like they had it all together, or who were trying to live like they had it all together, saw no need for Jesus. That would have been too embarrassing for them. But those who knew they were small, those who knew they needed Jesus, well, they were the ones who had the true strength. Their praise was a stronghold against all of their troubles. Their smallness was their strength. When we're drawn into a much bigger story than ourselves, into something much more beautiful and bigger than ourselves, when we experience the wonder and awe of God, we realize we're small, and that becomes our strength. And the wonderful thing is as well that when we become small, when we recognize our smallness, our world gets bigger. Notice that there is a change that happens in this psalm. Let me read it for you. After considering the world, the universe that God has created and how much greater God must be, The psalmist, King David, then says, what is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? In other words, he's realized just how small we are, not just how infinitely small he is, but the whole of human history, the whole of humankind are like nothing to God, or should be. Because there is an instant flip where he says, you have made humankind a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. And then the rest of the psalm goes on to show just how much God values human beings and how much he's entrusted us with the care of his world. It starts off with the smallness. We are so tiny and insignificant, but that smallness then leads into a bigger world, where we are somehow considered just a little lower than the angels, a little lower than heavenly beings, heavenly creatures. Because our worlds often get too small, even when things are going fine. When things are stressful and overwhelming, our worlds get very small. We get very focused on all of the problems, and they seem like absolutely everything. But really, we're obsessing over these tiny details in the terms of what's actually going on in the world. Small things. Small fry. But even when things are going well, we have a tendency to live in a much smaller world, a much smaller universe than is actually out there. I love the way that C.S. Lewis put it in one of his sermons. C.S. Lewis, writer of Chronicles of Narnia, put it like this in one of his sermons. It would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition, when infinite joy is offered to us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea, we are far too easily pleased. I love that image that most of humanity, our default position, is making pies out of mud, not realizing that we have this world to explore, this grand vista that we are invited into. We are far too easily satisfied with our small lives. But when we practice awe and wonder, when we're drawn into the bigger story of God, we realize that the world we are invited into is much, much bigger than that. So how do we go about practicing awe and wonder if we don't, like Moses, conveniently have a pillar of cloud and fire following us around, or a mountain that's consumed by the fire of God, or like Jeremiah with earthquakes and fire and winds going on around us, or without, a temple and a holy of holies to walk into, all of these things that have been experienced throughout the Bible. We don't have those things to hand. So how do we get an awe-inspiring experience of God? Well, it starts simply by pausing and paying attention. No one who was ever inspired by awe and wonder, saw something incredible, was in a rush. No one was like, oh, gotta get the train, running. Wow, incredible sunset, run. Like, when you are captured by something awe-inspiring, sometimes you stop to the extent that you even stop breathing. Have you ever been so captured by something that you realize you forgot to breathe for a bit? There is something natural about pausing when something is awe-inspiring. And so if we're actually going to get into the space where we are drawn out of our small world into God's bigger world, we need to stop by pausing, to give it a chance, and then by paying attention. In the Psalm, King David writes, "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers," that means he was actually paying attention to the universe that God created. He was looking at the moon. He was looking at the stars. He was thinking about the vastness of creation, the beauty of creation. He was giving it its due attention. I find it really interesting that there's a growing number of scientists who are, nonetheless committed atheists, but have a sense of wonder and beauty about the universe because it's just so incredible. They cannot but marvel. There comes a point where the numbers on the page are just not enough, and they just recognize this thing is incredible. There's a prayer app that quite a few of us in church love called Lectio 365. Really recommend it to you. It gives you a morning and an evening prayer. You can listen to it or you can read it. It's really good. And a few weeks ago, there was a quote from a poet who I previously didn't know, called Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who lived in the 19th century. And both me and Geraldine, who's in the church, loved this quote. We were talking about it in midweek church, and it goes like this extract from her poem. Earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes, the rest sit round and pluck blackberries. Love that idea that Moses saw this bush on fire and it was the presence of God. But Elizabeth Barrett Browning is insinuating that every bush is aflame for those who will pause and pay attention to the fingerprints of God in creation. There's a guy also in whose story is recorded in Genesis, whose name's Jacob, and he had quite an interesting life. And in one of the many moments where his life was in danger, he lies down in the middle of the wilderness, in the middle of the desert. And in his dream, God shows him that where he's lying, there is a ladder between him and heaven, with angels going up and down it into the celestial realm, that he is on the grounds of something incredibly special and holy. And he wakes up and says, surely God was in this place and I was not aware of it. And that line of his has haunted me for years. This idea that God could be at work in my workplace, at my home, as I walk down the street, in any number of places, and I could just be passing it by, not seeing God. But those who pause and pay attention get to see God at work there. But sometimes people don't go through the things and on to God, but rather get obsessed with the things themselves. So a few years ago, I got the privilege of spending a summer with an amazing church down in Cornwall, a church for surfers that had a cafe and showers and a skate ramp and all those kind of things, that did baptisms in the sea surrounded by everyone's surfboards. It was just an amazing, special church. And I loved my summer with them. But one of the days I was there, I was chatting to this guy who used to be the local drug dealer, had this amazing story of his life turned around by Jesus. But he was chatting to me, and because, like a lot of people down in Cornwall, very connected to nature, very connected to the earth. And he was saying, Dave, when I see that wave, I'm like, that's God. And when I see that rock, like, that's God. And as I was listening to him, I knew that he was falling into an ancient heresy called Pantheism. This idea that God is nature, that God is the things. And this is one of the things that the Bible warns about all the way through, is not to worship the created things, but to worship the Creator. When we admire a sunset or a mountain, we should move through it and onto the one who created it. Because if that is beautiful, if that is great, if that is ancient, how much more ancient, how much more greater, how much more beautiful is the one who made it? But some people get stuck and equate the creation with the Creator, which is an ancient danger. And it's something that's happening all around us, this increased spirituality from people who have this natural, good desire to find meaningful things in the world, to find spirituality out in the world. And it's finding its place in things like crystals and circles and tarot and all of those kind of things. And what's happening is this good desire to find meaning in the world is stopping short. It's stopping at the created things instead of going through them to the one who created them, the one who calls out to us. It's worshipping the wave instead of the wave maker, the rock instead of the rock maker, the one who came up with this in the first place. So we pause, we pay attention to where God's fingerprints are in creation, and that should move us to worship. But our worship itself can be imaginative, can be playful, can be places that inspire this awe and wonder, this exploration of the goodness of God. There is a reason cathedrals are beautiful. There's a reason there is colourful stained glass. There's a reason that the people who lead worship there have these ornate robes, swinging, sweet-smelling incense, that there is theatre to things. It's not just because they're old-fashioned and religious, but those things are multi-sensory. They draw us into worship of God. They inspire awe and wonder in us. Artwork can be a place where our awe and wonder of God is inspired, and that's what they're trying to do. We used to go to a church in Chester when we first got married, which is a brilliant church again, but its building dated back to when it was quite a poor neighborhood, a very working class neighborhood. And the people who built it wanted them to have a place of awe and wonder. And so it was full of beauty, was this old building. And intended to inspire people, draw them up to think of God, to think of the greater things, to think of the higher things in life. A walk in nature can inspire prayer and worship. So can an art gallery. So can a great piece of music. Our prayer can be anything from dancing to singing and music, playing an instrument, crafting, journaling, you name it. Journaling was one of the big breakthroughs for me. I started prayer journaling about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And it suddenly for me became much easier to concentrate, to reflect, not just to write, but maybe to draw, to doodle, to bring my mind back to things that God had said to me in the previous week. You know, our worship is supposed to move way beyond our head and into our bodies, into our hearts, into our emotions, which means it can be done in all kinds of ways. And what happens as we practice this imaginative prayer, as we pause and we ponder and reflect, we see the fingerprints of God, we see how great He is. We are drawn out of ourselves in awe and wonder, and then our imaginations are expanded by the possibilities of God. There's a guy called Tom Wright. He used to be a bishop, and he's a theologian, very smart guy, and he wrote the book on the resurrection, on Jesus coming back from the dead and being alive in this new type of human body, living forever. The promise of all that would follow him would have this same resurrection. But anyway, he wrote the book on the historicity of the resurrection, the fact that it actually happened, that no one who was alive at the time would have come up with what happened. There was no basis for it. It was mind expanding. And so he goes around and he debates people who don't think it happened. He says, like, often they just, because he's thought it through so thoroughly, once all the arguments are exhausted, they reach the end, and at some point the other person will say, I just can't imagine something like that happening. To which Tom Wright replies, well, you need to smarten up your imagination. They simply could not imagine, see in their minds an event like this happening. And so therefore they conclude it mustn't happen because I can't think of it. But the possibilities that God has for us and for this world are far beyond what we are capable of imagining right now. In the book of Ephesians, another letter to a church, it prays to a God who can do things beyond our imagination, beyond what we could even dream of happening. Right now, we are in a moment where a lot of doom is being preached, where our news feeds are filled with death and dying and destruction. And that makes the world feel doomed and small and inevitable. But God is not a God of the inevitable. God is a God of the possible, of possibilities. When Jesus walked into a situation, you never got the sense that he was seeing it through the eyes of, oh, well, this is over, this is no good, this is doomed. He meets this woman at the well. He's had affair after affair after affair. And instead of saying, you know, that's a hopeless case, what he sees in her is an evangelist. And indeed, she ends up going back into the community where she was distanced from, where her shame was, and reconnects them to tell them all about this wonderful person, Jesus. He saw possibility where everyone else saw hopelessness. He comes to the funeral of his friend and, you know, he weeps because it is sad and it is wrong. But all the same, he thanks his Father in heaven and calls his friend Lazarus out of the grave. That is a different pair of eyes. Our BBC News feed just sees inevitability, destruction, hopelessness, despair. But that's not how God sees the world. When we pause, when we stop freaking out, when we stop feeling stressed and overwhelmed, but look to the goodness and the greatness of God who has got this, and the fact that we are not God, our imaginations can be expanded to see this world with possibility and not inevitability. Awe and wonder is a wonderful place to start from. It is a practice to be fostered in order that we can be better news to our families and our neighborhoods and ourselves. Because God has got this. We don't got this. God has got this. So let me end by reading again Psalm 8, this prayer of awe and wonder. Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Through the praise of children and infants, you have established a stronghold against your enemies, to silence the foe and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what are mere mortals that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. You have made them a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned them with glory and honor. You made them rulers over the works of your hands, and you put everything under their feet. All flocks and herds and the animals of the wild, the birds in the sky and the fish in the sea, all that swim in the paths of the seas. Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. So may your smallness be your strength. May you be liberated by your dependence on God, and may you live free in his grace this week. Thank you for joining us. If you're not part of StoryHouse Church and you want to know more, just get in touch with us through our website. It's the quickest way, but through social media as well. Eventually one of us will get a hold of that message. Thanks for joining us. Take care of yourselves and hope to see you soon. Bye now.